Welcome to the afternoon panel of the 6th Annual Multidisciplinary Conference, sponsored by the College of Humanities and Social Sciences here at William Paterson University. I'm Dr. Sumi Raghavan from the Psychology Department, and I have the pleasure of introducing this afternoon's panel. If you're just joining us today, welcome. And for those of you who have been with us for previous talks, we hope you're enjoying your time at the conference so far. I'd like to again acknowledge the co-sponsorship and generous support of William Paterson University's Alumni Association's Distinguished Visiting Professorship, the Office of Sophomore and Junior Experience, and the Office of Employment and Equity Diversity. I'd also like to just take this moment to remind everyone to please silence your cell phones, but please do keep them handy so you can tweet your questions at us with the hashtag BYO Truth. So our conference theme of BYO Truth strives to create a space where we can discuss many of our current hot-button issues around truth and information. In President Obama's farewell speech last January, he said, quote, "Without some common baseline of facts, without a willingness to admit new information and concede that your opponent is making a fair point and that science and reason matter, we'll keep talking past each other." Just several weeks later, we were introduced to the concept of alternative facts, which Kellyanne Conway described as additional facts and alternative information. And the public discourse of 2017 seems dominated by these competing notions of truth and facts. Many of us academics in the room have had these conversations for a long time. But right now, ground zero for these debates is actually online, in digital spaces, on social media feeds, message boards, and comment threads. No doubt you've all seen this and possibly participated in it. In fact, a 2017 survey conducted by the Pew Research Center reveals that 67% of Americans say that they receive their news in some form through social media. But evidence also points to the misuse of social media platforms and their role in spreading misinformation. So this leads us to question, what news exactly are 67% of Americans consuming? Is it fake news? Is it truth? Our next two panelists will explore notions of truth in digital spaces in a panel entitled Circulating Truth and Misinformation. I'm pleased to introduce our two panelists today. Please welcome Dr. Jennifer Forestal, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Stockton University. Professor Forestal researches the effects of digital technologies, software design, and physical architecture on democratic politics. And Dr. Paul Mihailidis, Associate Professor of Marketing and Communication at Emerson College. Professor Mihailidis' research explores the nexus of media literacy, young people, and political engagement in civic life. Please welcome our panelists, and we look forward to hearing your questions at the end of the talk. Would you like to speak?
Okay, I think so. All right. Thanks everyone for being here, and I appreciated so much the earlier panel, so I hope we will continue that conversation. So I'm a political theorist by trade. That means I sort of straddle the line between political science and philosophy, so my remarks today will sort of inhabit that straddling. So today I'm going to be talking about the ways that the spread of misinformation online that we've seen over the past few months, years, betrays sort of more serious underlying problems with the ways that publics are organized with digital technologies. So when we talk about we all know that fake news is a problem. It's becoming even more so. But diagnoses of these problems tend to take two directions. So the in the first, some people advocate what I'm calling the responsibility model. They're asking that sites like Facebook and Google take responsibility for the content on their sites and sort of work harder to prevent fake news from spreading. The root of the problem then is seen to be the sort of laissez-faire policies of these sites, their disavowal of their role as media platforms, and sort of abdication of responsibility that these companies seem to be doing. In the second, other people, though, argue for what I call the authentic news model. And they call for news outlets, so the New York Times, the Washington Post, to stop feeding into this impulse towards clickbait and instead sort of renew a commitment to independent investigative journalism. Here, then, the root of the problem isn't that the content is being let through, but instead that media companies are sort of succumbing to their worst impulses and creating content that is maybe not so accurate, like the PR releases that we saw earlier this morning. Both of these models are sort of accurate, but a lot of them are pointing to gatekeeping, or the role of elites in managing public discourse online. And I think that while that's important, it is a little bit too narrow. Instead, what all of these models are suggesting is that the problem of misinformation is a problem of content. This is either content that's created problematically or is problematically allowed to slip through social media platforms, instead of thinking about the way that misinformation is actually a reflection of the problematic way that digital publics are organized and that people interact with one another online. In all of these cases, then, what we are ignoring in our conversations is the role of citizens. So I am arguing for more democracy. Okay. So this is not a new debate. This is actually a debate over the nature of truth and the state of the modern public. It's a debate over whether citizens have the capacities to participate in public life. And it's a very old one. So this spread of fake news then, when placed into a historical context, which I'll do a little bit today, it is not a wholly new problem. It's in fact a very old one, and it's just a new iteration of something that's been around for a really long time. So I will make sort of three general interventions today. In the first, I'm going to discuss the concept of fake news as a kind of propaganda, right? And I think thinking about it as propaganda clarifies not only the effects of fake news that we've talked a lot about, but also the causes, like why is it so popular in the first place? The second thing I'll do then is discuss why current approaches, these gatekeeping models, really are not really getting at the heart of the problem. Gatekeeping addresses the consequences of propaganda, but it sort of takes a symptom for the cause, and it fails to address these underlying breakdown in democratic practices, right? Things that citizens should be doing. Third, then, instead of giving up entirely on citizens, I think that we should think about how to reorganize our digital platforms in a way that is more helpful to users, that involves them in these ongoing processes of sort of investigation, persuasion, debate. In other words, we need to think about how to organize publics, both on and offline, in a manner that makes sort of democratic problem solving possible, right? That brings citizens into the process in a really robust way. Okay. So fake news, I think, is best understood as a form of propaganda, which is also a term that we throw around a lot. But I will be using then Harold Lasswell's definition, writing in 1927. So Lasswell is a very famous political scientist, also famous in sociology. He wrote about the use of propaganda in the First World War and defines it in the sort of widest possible terms. Propaganda is conducted by governments, private companies, individuals, but in all of its manifestations, propaganda is communication that works through the direct manipulation of social suggestion. In other words, propaganda alters people's perceptions of the world around them. It also then hopes to change their behavior, right? They want to change the way people think about things so that they'll do different things than they were going to. So all of the kind of fake news mechanisms would clearly fall under this category. The importance then is not that what propaganda does to us, but why it's so successful. And for Lasswell, again, writing in 1927, it's not actually a skill of a propagandist, right? It's not the actual media person that makes propaganda successful, right? It's not the ability to craft an effective message or the ability to hit the right kind of platform. It's a way that the publics are organized that makes people susceptible to propaganda. Right, so the critical skill of the propagandist is in their ability to understand and exploit a favorable set of social circumstances. In particular, these social circumstances then are the result of technological and social changes that have made the world so large and so complex and so completely overwhelming that at any given time, we are all not sure how we fit in it, what we can do, or how to understand everything that's being thrown at us, right? The world is so complex that we can't figure things out for ourselves, and so we are just sort of ready for propagandists to tell us what to do and how to believe, right? We need some guidance. So if the success of propaganda is due to this kind of social disorganization, right? It's the idea that people are just so lost and confused that they'll take help from anywhere they can get. It's not clear that a return to gatekeeping is actually going to solve that problem, right? It might give them better information, but it's not actually going to fix the underlying issue. Instead, we need to think about the larger social dynamics that caused us to feel lost and confused in the first place. So, in many ways, the responses to the problem of propaganda or fake news, things like fact-check tags, browser plugins, changing algorithms to nudge people in the right direction, these are all enacting a vision of democratic society that was popularized by Walter Lippmann, famous journalist writing in the 1920s. Lippmann suggests that people can't handle being active democratic citizens, right? It's just too much and they don't have the capacity to do it. So what we should do instead is just totally get rid of their responsibility. We should just let the experts take care of it, and the citizens can sort of check in from time to time, but let's just leave them into their own lives. It's all they can handle. The role of citizens is really just oversight. Experts are doing all of the work, which is, again, sort of where we're at in relying on Google to take care of this problem for us. But to rely solely or even mostly on these gatekeeping mechanisms that are providing specific minimal channels for user input or public input is really undemocratic. These approaches might lead to more efficient decision-making. We might get facts better or faster, but they are relieving us of the responsibility as citizens in identifying what our interests are and with working together to try and achieve them. Gatekeeping measures then influence our decisions in ways increasingly that we are unable to identify, that we don't know are happening, or have full ability to sort of have input into that process. So this is a critique of this kind of model. And it's one that John Dewey sort of leveled at Walter Lippmann, again, many, many years ago, rejecting the idea that citizens are fundamentally incapable of democratic decision-making. Instead, we should, again, not give up on citizens, but we need to reorganize society in a way that makes us not feel so lost and confused. That way we can actually get to the hard work of democratic politics. This is just not a personal preference. For John Dewey, democracy itself, if we are going to call ourselves a democratic society, it means that every single citizen actually has to be involved in determining the direction of their community and working to achieve that kind of end. And importantly then, this has an effect on how we understand truth. We've been talking about truth a lot today in terms of objective facts, right? That's a function of maybe of starting off with hard sciences. But truth is not, according to Dewey and many other philosophers, something that can be objectively identified and dictated to a passive public, right? Because the truth of any matter not only involves the facts of a situation, but also the social context and the consequences for your lives that give those facts meaning. Right? Me just telling you that vaccines are going to fix smallpox doesn't mean anything to you if you have no concept of smallpox, if it's not a threat to you, right? Those facts take on a different kind of meaning when they're embedded in social circumstances. And so the value of democratic politics, then, is not really in finding the right answer, because the answers are always going to be contestable. We will always have new information that comes at us, or new opinions, or new technology, or new social contexts. Instead, the value of democracy is in the process of decision-making, right? The process that we all involve ourselves in investigating, debating, managing the consequences of living together. This then is a process of social inquiry, and it requires a particular kind of organization to achieve it. So gatekeeping mechanisms are helpful, but they don't actually get to the root of the problem. And so we need to sort of think about what it takes to organize a public in a way that helps us get to that end, that we can understand the truth and make sense of it for our own lives. And this means building sites with 3 distinct characteristics. The first then is common interests. Because if democratic politics is the work of managing the consequences of the things we hold in common, right? Managing the consequences of sharing this space, for example, means all filing in rows and figuring out how to manage that. Then that really requires that we know what it is that we have in common. If individuals can't understand the position within their interpersonal networks, right? If you're in a university and you have no earthly idea who else is part of that community, then you're not going to feel like you have anything in common with them. You're not going to start working in any way. So the foundation of a commonly identified interest gives citizens common ground from which to begin this work of democratic politics. But common interests are not enough. We also need shared norms of discourse. Because again, just having something in common isn't enough to motivate people to work together. Many longstanding problems of political science are collective action problems. Just because you know you have something in common doesn't mean you care about it. And this is because finding meaning in facts is an artistic as well as an intellectual endeavor, right? We need to make sure that people care about something. And the way that we make sure that people care about something is by appealing to their sympathies. So again, your ideas of what's important or interesting or the way that someone will be convincing to you as a student of William Paterson University is much different than an employee of Google. But these shared norms of discourse are not enough. We also need, again, as our earlier presentations have talked about, we need a specifically democratic norms of discourse. And this really means a kind of open-mindedness, an ability to be open to new ideas, be welcoming to new people, to be able to interact with things that you're not quite sure that you understand. When we fail to cultivate that kind of ethos of inquiry, right, we become members of closed communities. And we make ourselves vulnerable to manipulation because we allow our cognitive biases, our manipulation to sort of work on this, make us feel good about getting information that just fits with what we know. And this is the kind of unquestioning acceptance that we see too often in digital spaces. So what does this mean for Facebook, which is what I'll talk about next. So we'll talk briefly about Facebook and Reddit to show you how these kinds of three characteristics, common interest, shared norms, and an ethos of inquiry, shape the kind of reactions that we see in these spaces. So Facebook relationships are dyadic. Right, for the most part, users connect with each of their friends individually. One's network on Facebook is centered around individuals, right? You create and approve all of the friends that you have, so you are connected as individuals. This individualization means that the site really fails to highlight what people have in common, right? You know what you have in common with your one friend who you grew up with, but you don't know what you have in common with other people on the site who sometimes you never even see at all, right? So Facebook acts as a way for individual users to connect with other individual users. And this has an effect for the kinds of activities that we see on the site. We don't see a specific communal tone on Facebook. There's really no shared norms of discourse on this space. Because if you don't know who your audience is, you're going to default to the lowest common denominator, right? Things like, love, ha, right? Things that everyone sort of shares. And so the result is, again, a scattered and disorganized public on which we saw misinformation spread pretty quickly. It's very difficult to tailor your news and information, make sense of it, unless it fits with your existing worldview. Reddit, by contrast, is built in a kind of different way. It helps users identify their interests, right? So you enter into a subreddit knowing that everyone else in that space shares the same interests as you do. And it's from that sort of common interest that you might build other ties. You see these people over and over again. They have really great ideas about movies, and so you continue to talk with them and build a relationship. And so what we see on Reddit is that there's also distinct norms in each space. So right here I have the norms of discourse for the philosophy subreddit, the political science subreddit, and the grilled cheese subreddit. They are quite different. They have different rules. You're allowed to do different things, and you're not allowed to do different things. And so the diversity of these sites testifies to the kind of activity that we see on the site. People embody their community. They cultivate a specific attitude. They cultivate a specific kind of norms of discourse that shape the way that people talk on the site. They see things through the lens of their subreddit. And so what we can see here then, right, is that Reddit indicates, this analysis here indicates that Reddit is organizing its site more democratically than Facebook does. People have a common interest. They have shared norms. That's great. Except when it isn't. So this is a screenshot of R the Donald. Because there are subreddits that are undemocratic. There are subreddits that become, over time, more self-consciously closed. I don't know if you can see it, but one of their rules is that this is a site only for supporters of Trump, right? So they are not open to new information. And these communities, we have seen and research shows, are more susceptible to fake news. It's not an anomaly that Pizzagate came out of this subreddit, right? They are ready to listen to information that confirms their biases. So what does this mean? What do we do now? Because we can see then that Facebook and Reddit might both deserve the criticisms that were leveled at them because they don't fit these conditions that we need. They don't meet all three of them anyway. But we can also think about how we might change them for the better, right? So the problem with Facebook was that it was individualized. Facebook has started now to shape or to emphasize groups of people, right? So you might enter into Pantsuit Nation or the March for Science and know that people on that message board are going to be talking about science or about liberalness, I guess. And so that's, again, one step that Facebook might take to turn from a site of individuals into a site of groups to once again highlight common interests. Reddit, by contrast, has largely taken to sort of banning or quarantining bad subreddits or aggressive subreddits, and this is, again, not necessarily the most democratic solution. So instead, they've been working also with researchers at the MIT Media Lab to think about alternative, more democratic ways. Posting subreddit-specific norms of discourse, then, on a site has been shown to increase the rule compliance by new posters. So just reminding people that these are the rules of the site, like, please obey them, works. At the same time, it still increases performance, right? And so we see a lot of people that still want to post when it's clear what the rules are. Likewise, we can see some subreddits using AI, right, to encourage subredditors to fact-check suspicious news sources. So rather than allowing the algorithm to just clear it away, right, what this does, bot at the top, posts a little note that says, this might be sketchy information. Can someone check it out? And we see that people do, right? So it's not gatekeeping in the sense that the overlords at Facebook or the algorithm changes it for us. It's asking the Redditors to do it themselves, right? To take ownership and responsibility for their communities. And so what we're seeing here are, again, more democratic ways to fight or combat misinformation, but ones that are very community-specific, in which citizens or users take ownership of their sites, and the result is a more democratic regulation of digital public discourse. So what does this mean? The proliferation and effect of fake news is really a concern, I think, for everyone who's invested in maintaining a robust democracy, which should be all of us. But recent solutions, then, the ones that are the most popular, have taken a narrow approach to this problem of misinformation. Most solutions have emphasized the role of gatekeepers, but while the effect of stronger gatekeepers might be better for conveying facts to citizens, numbers, statistics, it is not the whole story, and in doing so, it has minimized the role of citizens and site users in taking responsibility for managing their own communities. In other words, it's less democratic. So in addition to the role of experts, I'm also arguing that we should reinvigorate the norms and practices of democratic problem solving and citizen action. And so the first thing that we need to do in order to make this happen is to pay more attention to the different ways that we are acting on social media sites. What are we allowed to do on Facebook that we're not allowed to do on Twitter? What are we allowed to do on Reddit? Or what kinds of behaviors does it invite from us? We need to be more cognizant of the way that we operate in these sites and the things that we are allowed or disallowed from doing. Finally, we need to clarify, though, the proper relationship between experts and citizens. This was a big part of the keynote's conclusion as well, so hopefully we can talk about it. Because the reinvigoration of a democratic public does not mean that we need to get rid of experts or shun them. That is not what I'm saying. But it does mean that we need to figure out how experts and citizens should relate to one another, right? What is the proper role of citizens and site users? What is the proper role of experts in this new configuration? And so we need to think about how we can build sites that foster a supportive relationship between the two. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. That was great, and I'm going to be the transition man into my talk. So my name is Paul Mihailidis, and I am the last, I think, formal talk of the day. So I'd like to thank William Paterson and the committee for putting this together. It's a fantastic day, and I'm happy to be a part of it. My talk today is a basic outline of a new project that I've been working on, which is going to pick up on some of what you've heard earlier today and with our keynote, looking at some of the new norms of digital culture that are shifting because of our relationship to technologies and what's been lost in that, and ways that we might think about reimagining and engagement to combat what is maybe we are calling an age of distrust or mistrust, and there's been other terms to talk about it. So again, I'm an associate professor at Emerson College in Boston, Massachusetts, and I focus a lot on this concept of civic media and media literacy, so how people learn to use media to engage meaningfully in their communities. And so I'm going to put a few theories out there on what these new emerging norms are, and hopefully allow those to be provocative and engage us in thinking really hard about the way that we approach media and civil dialogue, or media and community engagement. And because I think these new norms of culture are shifting, and I used to be much more optimistic about this, but now I think I think, for example, that some of these technologies that we're so used to kind of negotiating with meaningfully have hit a tipping point, or have hit a point of commodification that necessitate us to rethink what they're doing for us. So I have 3 emerging norms that I'm going to go through, and I'm going to use those to explain this idea of what civic media literacies are. The first norm I have is what this theory of spectacle, which is something you might have heard of if you're following the news or thinking about technology. So I think spectacle, what I'm calling legacy and digital social media platforms, are increasingly partisan, commodified, and polarized spaces of confrontation, where young people are subject to highly personalized information design, greater targeted advertising, and content that breeds reductionist expression. So I've been looking at this for over a decade. You guys would probably recognize all of these icons. What I'm calling new legacy networks. These spaces started, and they still are branded as sites for collaboration, for potential for meaningful engagement, and they're still used for solid connectivity and engagement in society. I think that's still all good and well, but I think that these networks have become commodified to the point that they are intentionally designed to extract data from us for their own gains of revenue, and through that, the way that they've found their algorithms to be most extractive is to prioritize sensational, partisan, and reductionist content, things that, as we learned in the keynote today, are more prone for us to want to spread. And so what's happening now, I think, through spaces like Facebook, Google is one of the biggest pressures, but even YouTube. YouTube gets, what is it? It's something like 70 hours a minute of new content, and it always talks about being this place for great expression. And I think that's great. Like, everyone can post on there, but in reality, your post is as meaningless, perhaps, to a larger narrative as talking to a neighbor might be in the larger sense. YouTube is extracting all of that, and the chances that messages scale on YouTube are fairly non-existent. It's a completely commodified platform, and YouTube Red is the start of YouTube becoming simply another multi-channel network in and of itself. So when these networks prioritize, when they prioritize extracting data and information from us, they design algorithms to intentionally put forward the most spreadable content. And this is where I think this phenomenon of spectacle comes to mind. Spectacle is something that a critical theorist, Guy Debord, starts, where he talked about it's not a collection of images, rather a social relationship between people mediated by images. So how people use images to come together around various ideologies and thoughts. He was talking about this at the beginning of mass media and TV. Today, we see these social relationships mediated by images, but defined by network publics. So they don't need a mass media to be perpetuated. In fact, citizens are really awesome at starting spectacle and perpetuating it and spreading it, right? So this might be familiar to you. This is our friend Pepe the Frog. There's a long and wonderful story behind Pepe, who started in Reddit and 4chan as an online comic, if you guys know, back in 2006, 2007, and was appropriated for a host of political means. But the amazing thing is here that he was started in these networks that Jennifer was talking about, and he was appropriated and then spread, and then the spectacle emerged, and then the spectacle was it was legitimated by mainstream media, who feel they have no choice but to opt into these networks to become part of it. So politicians cover it. It becomes a part of this cohesive narrative. So what happens with something like Pepe is that this deep underbelly of the web is a space where these narratives can become so large and have so many people hooking onto them that they get legitimated as newsworthy. And journalism organizations and the mainstream media have not really much of a choice but to opt into these networks as well, because it's where they find the most audiences. So spectacle, in this sense, is prioritized by networks and then legitimated as it moves forward. Alongside spectacle is the second thing I'm going to put up. So spectacle is complemented by what is now significant levels of distrust. So a crisis of legitimacy, which is not anything new. The media institutions and media have often functioned from a point of distrust, but it's animated now by alternative media and politicians who question the basic functions of our public institutions. So because of having these networks that are largely self-serving, they're very homophilous. Like Jennifer said, they gather like-minded people together, and they're designed to put people with people like them more and more. And they're not allowing as much democratic dialogue. So one result of this is people become validated in the beliefs of their community. Because what's the best way, in the book that some of you got over lunch, one of the best ways to feel validated is not by an expert telling you that you've done great, by your peers supporting you. So communities sharing information, less concerned with truth, and more concerned with feeling good about their ideas, getting validated by their peers, allows them to open up distrust against institutions that they're not familiar with or have no relationships to. So trust is down everywhere, but with media, it's the most. And just to pick up on this fake news thing quickly, fake news is complicated, but I do think it emerges from a specific technological age, right? Like distribution and cost is approaching zeros. As a result, reputations are far more expandable because there are much more competing players to get attention that don't need the same infrastructure or transaction costs to promote it. And we don't have any way to regulate these. These companies call themselves technology companies and not media companies. And so they're really absolved of any of those regulations that might put forward. At the same time, there's a professor from Penn State University who talks a lot about, he's been doing research a psychologist who's been doing research for decades, looking at online newsreaders and talking about layers. Like online newsreaders don't really care about the importance of journalistic sources as much, because they care more about the values, that their values are supported. So this idea of facts and experts don't matter as much. And layers is important. If you're getting information through a social network, which most of us are, it's coming from an aggregated site that a friend might have shared with you, that you have to click into and then click again to get to the original source. That's way too much work for anybody, me included. It also lends to implicitness, right? If a good friend of mine that I trust shares something right away, I will blindly trust that far more than I'll be like, I wonder what that person's sharing that for. Because if he's sharing with it, Facebook has designed it so that him and I are seeing eye to eye, because it's much more likely that I will share the content that he posted, right? So it's long, complicated, but it all makes sense if you look at Pizzagate. Pizzagate, which you mentioned, was enabled by this culture of distrust. A group of citizens, this is a pretty fascinating and incomprehensible slide, showing you that this was propagated and started by a group of concerned citizens who got leaked emails and created a web of of conspiracy theories around the Democratic Party harboring a child sex ring in a pizza shop in Northwest DC. And it went so far, their rumors went so far, millions of people gathered on it, and then all the mainstream media outlets covered this, hence legitimating the spectacle and the distrust of the thing in and of itself, right? So when we think more about this fake news problem, we should think about it in a lot of nuanced terms, but I also think this is just a problem where there are small groups. This is the Vecna Morozov who writes this quote up here. The problem's not fake news, but a digital capitalism that makes it profitable to reduce false but click-worthy stories. So we see small groups of concerted individuals simply working through the capital mechanics of the web. So targeted advertising, SEO, SEM, that are making vast impacts. And our goal is either to trust gatekeepers or citizens, which is kind of crazy. And then the third thing, I'm going through this quickly, but it's all super important. The third thing is what I'm calling an agency gap. So we have time. So out of these two things, I think, we have a culture of spectacle that media organizations perpetuate through the design. And then we have distrust. So if you put a bunch of people in social networks together with each other and they feel like they're validating ideologies, they're much quicker to distrust things without even needing to reasonably force it. So what I think out of these new norms has emerged is a gap between concern and our capacity to act. And this is where I think this idea of civic media literacies come into. So I'm going to show you guys a quick, this opened up the wrong thing, but I'm just going to do it from here. So what this is, just very quickly, you can see here, and this is a, oops, sorry. Okay, so this is an ad for something we're going to give money to. This is made by a doctoral student at Penn State University. Can you guys see this? No, you can't see it on this screen.
Yeah. Yeah.
No.
This is it.
Okay. You have to close the whole PowerPoint?
Yeah, you have to close this.
Okay. There it is. Okay.
So go back.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'm showing you very quickly is what I think. So on the bottom here, you can't really see it, I think because of the lighting. Can you guys see this at all? Oh, there it is. You see it now? That was magic. All I have to do is point at screens. This is a map of the world, which you can't see very well. And this is a graduate student who created an algorithm to document every public civic protest in the world from the early 1980s to present. Every time a protest happened that was covered by media, it comes up as a yellow dot, and it gets stronger. So I don't know if you can see that, but the middle is Europe, and there's Asia, and some of Northern Africa, and then the United States is over there. What you'll see happen here is increasing amounts of protests. So if you look at the turn of the 2000s, you see these dots getting a little bit more intense. And now you look at early 2000s, thank you. You see it getting more intense here. This is when Google and computers are in everyone's home and social networks become around, right? Social networks become around, and you see how much more intense this power gets. Now, you could argue that we just have a world that's way more engaged, and we have people doing way more meaningful civic work and protesting the idea that they don't like. Look what's happening now when Facebook is ubiquitous and Twitter's around and YouTube. Look at all that protesting. What happened? 2013. Is the whole world falling apart? Did that what happened? Then you go back to the beginning of this, and you see barely any protests happening. I'm going to get out of that. Oops. And then I'm going to find where we were. Okay. And then we're coming back here. So what I'm arguing with this idea of an agency gap is that not that we're more active, but these tools and technologies that are perpetuating spectacle and in a context of distrust make it easy for us to share our concern. They're designed for us to yell about things. And what they've done by conflating meaningful action taken and engagement with us yelling about things we like and don't like is they've conflated this idea of sharing concern and taking meaningful action. So we abstract community involvement for spreading and liking things online. We think it's great to support all these things and yell. And if you ever go down on these tools, the things that are shared most are the most vitriolic, the most partisan, and the most sensational. And that graph shows, like, we are yelling more, but I don't know how that's translating into meaningful action or reform. It seems like the yelling more simply gets us involved more. So when I ask that question, what happens when we yell more but act less, is you see this all around the world, these great protests where we yell and then we take yelling into the streets, right? And on the other hand, we get something like this, where these technologies seem to be doing very little. We've kind of hit this frail point of really knowing how to articulate concern, keeping it mostly online. And this is Wael Ghonim, who was one of the facilitators anonymously of the first Facebook pages that started the Tahrir Square uprisings in Europe. And he, in his recent work, talked about this internet as both a liberating mechanism, but also a mechanism that led to a lot of social discohesion. So he gave 5 main points about why he thinks the internet is leading to this fracturing, this concern of this gap between concern and the Capacity Act. We don't know how to deal with rumors. They spread too fast. We tend only to communicate with people we agree with. Online discussions quickly descend into angry mobs. We are forced to jump to conclusions, and we are favoring broadcasting over engagement and posts over discussions. We talk at and not with. So my argument here in the last few slides is to say that what I think has happened is our technologies have been codified and commodified to the point where they are intervening specifically in the way that we think about civility and civic dialogue and meaningful action taking. And they have become that way to the point that we can no longer make sense. They've almost reduced us to this idea of, like, so fake news to me is in this lineage of propaganda, but it's also, I think it emerges from a specifically technological age. And we talk a lot about, everyone thinks about this media literacy as solutionism. And I actually think that media literacy has become very problematic in how it approaches teaching people how to use media to engage. And if you were here at lunch, you heard some of these points, but we assume critical distance, that we can just, if we're critical thinkers and we can reasonably see how media works from a distance, that we can make decision. In fact, we know that's not right. That it's transaction. If I know how to use media, then I know how to be a good citizen. I actually don't think that's the case. We don't, if you have skills of critical media deconstruction, it doesn't always work that way. Prioritizes content. We often focus on what's wrong, how media distorts or does things wrong. And the biggest problem of me approaches to looking at media literacies and engagement is individual responsibility. That if I am knowledge, I will be a good citizen, which again refutes kind of a lot of this recent research in the end. So what I will conclude with here is this notion of what I think media literacies should be doing, what I think we need to engage in to reimagine how we understand media as a focus of civic engagement and how we combat things. It's not about being more critical thinkers. You guys, I'm sure, are really great critical thinkers, but it's almost like we're approaching critical thinking from the wrong set of values that we've forgotten about. We've become these distance robots that are made to think critically and then reflect and then go off and act in the world. So I think we've forgotten how to care. I think we don't know what it means to care about. We know how to care about a lot, and we show caring about all the time by yelling about things and thinking what's right or wrong. We don't know what it means to care for things. There's a big difference in caring about and caring for. Critical consciousness, standpoint formation. We often forget, look at who we are, where we come from, what our social and cultural resources are, and how we can best use them to make it different. Persistent engagement. In an age where everything's constantly going all the time and there's no time to contemplate, what does it mean to persistently engage? To be engaged in something over the long time where you don't always need it to be a spectacle to be engaged with it. And emancipatory, that maybe these tools and technologies aren't always the places we have to negotiate just because they're the biggest things. We need to start thinking about liberating technologies. When can we move beyond these frames and find means of communication and engagement that emancipate us from those people who oppressively place algorithms upon us? So I think if we re-look at the way we're using media, we could do it from a value set that starts to bring us back together and not simply try to make sense of these technologies again that have no stake in helping us make sense of anything in the first place. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you guys so much. We have some time for questions now from the audience. So please raise your hands. And we also have some time for Twitter questions. So please tweet your questions with the hashtag BYO Truth.
I know that's perfect.
Over here.
Who is it?
Thanks you guys for coming. I'm Mark. I'm a philosophy major, and I think I appreciated your last point about how we've forgotten to care. And I definitely think in our generation there's this apathy or this lack of kind of connection to the world, or we'll comment, but I think that kind of deeper care, caring for things. I agree, I guess, with what you're saying. So I guess, what do you think has caused that? Or maybe what are things that we can kind of identify as causing that to bring up in discussion? And I know you kind of touched on it in your presentation, but what are kind of solutions to maybe decreasing that apathy and that lack of care?
Sure. So I can try to set up. Thanks for the question. So actually, this agency gap idea, one of the findings that was a large research study that was completed 2 years ago, and one of the things, this apathy idea was one of the big findings we had, and why we talked to young people from 52 countries around the world, both in a huge survey and then also just going around these countries with a team and doing a lot of interviews. And one of the reasons why this agency gap has emerged is because these technologies have been where young people have been from very formative ages. So we were talking to 18 to 30-year-olds, and they had been in these spaces since they were 13, 14, 15, and these tools had become places where they were used to going because all their friends were there. And then once these tools started integrating news and information intentionally into there, they started to become more than just spaces of personal connection. And so what happened is everyone went there to become aware of everything, and they would get their information. And then when they started to look at all the comments and the way this was playing out, it either became really self-reaffirming or just really mean. And they lost hope. So they would say things like, in that study we found that they would say, social networks has helped me learn more about the world and care more about diversity, but I don't use it because everybody else on it is just being mean, and they're just being mean and insensitive. And so I trust everybody else less. So I'm not even going to bother to engage with it, which is it's the cynicism instead of skepticism. They don't want to engage because they see it. And I guess my argument is that these companies are designing for that to happen, because the meanest things are the things that get the most attention and bring out the most extreme views. That's what happened to cable news as it kind of evolved. So, and then the second part of that, what can we do? I mean, in this new book that'll be out in the spring, there's a whole host of cases where people are designing really interesting community engagement initiatives that are focused on bringing people together, and that media isn't at the focus. Like when people are doing civic and community initiatives, they often think we need to set up these media and we need to make YouTube videos and this and that. They're actually working on acts that can make people identify with things they care about, bring them into connection with each other, and then use media to share that. So it's kind of like a reverse approach to engineering community engagement. And there's really great work in caring about and caring for that I'm happy to share, that really kind of everyone cares about, but not many people care for. Do you want to add anything?
We have one in the back.
Oh, okay.
So this is a very interesting lecture. I'm actually going to piggyback on the whole mean world syndrome, the one that you just recently mentioned. So do you think that this is also a problem because of a political correct culture where people are afraid to speak their mind? And because they're afraid to speak their mind in a regular environment, they kind of take out the meanness within social media.
Sure. Yes and no. So I'll sort of avoid your question, I guess, by answering it differently, which is to say, a lot of these conversations that we've all been talking about all day require a level of trust and sort of reciprocity and accommodation I think we're not seeing. So the sort of political correctness is part of that, right? Like it's a question of how do we relate to one another, and without those kinds of understanding, right? This is how we talk to one another, or it's okay that I slip up because you trust that it wasn't intentional or I'm not trying to hurt you, or be mean. Without that sort of layer of understanding, which is what, again, you have those ties in a close-knit community. You have those ties, hopefully, in a functioning democratic public. And I think it's those ties that we've seen disintegrating that has led to the problem that you're talking about, where people feel, as if one misstep that, everything's shot, or that it's just mean, and sort of they're not giving each other the benefit of the doubt. So again, I think that's a symptom rather than a cause.
I'll just add quickly, just add very briefly. I actually, I think that it's also about it's also about a lack of. So there was an article a couple weeks ago about how we've lost the art of disagreeing. We don't know how to disagree civilly anymore, and I think that's kind of perpetuated by we are often in these self-serving homophilous networks, and we don't have as much dialogue in general. This idea of social capital, and we've lost the art to really understand what it's like to disagree, like to be in disagreement and to make that meaningful. And I think largely, like our major political systems have picked up on this underbelly of the web that is quite polarizing, and they've used that. And it's always been there, but it's just got a different space now. And that's kind of justified a real sensitivity to how we can actually disagree with each other in public spaces. And communities that work the best are normally just very, they're not very diverse, and that also stinks. So that's a problem.
Hello. So in the context of, in the first keynote speaker where we were talking about the community of knowledge and around that area, and then when we're talking about here and everything like that, and how technology has kind of expanded this community of knowledge, but in a way how the social media is also dividing us again into our own community of knowledges where we are supposed to be sharing these common interests. How do we take it from the context of then division? Because there is a lot of division going on in the community nowadays, and would you then say that the division of these common interests is preventing us from sharing our points of view online as well? Because if we think about it, right, if we go to like a YouTube channel, right, and you post something like a political question or something like that, and there will be a lot of discourse and everything like that, but there will also be a lot of like attacks from both sides of the spectrum. So are you saying that what we're missing is a moderate voice, that because there's so much discourse, it's dividing everybody into these two polar extremes?
Do you want to take that?
I can take it quickly. Thank you for that question. I can try. I mean, so I guess I would say overall that the internet, it's still, I don't want this to be simply, because overall there are still pockets and spaces where you have meaningful dialogue and engagement online, and the web still offers a lot of value. I think there are specific tools and technologies that have grown through a mechanism that doesn't necessarily promote that. But in an everyday kind of context, I think we all use these technologies and we get value out of them. But I do think, like, implicitly, I'm very aware of how much I I go on to certain social technologies and just implicitly fly through them with not even concerned about what their algorithm is promoting, or even assuming that there will be dialogue or engagement, because none of the negotiation of being with others in the world towards a common good happens in real time online. It's really just kind of replicated at a distance and by yourself. And so what the earlier keynote, I think the last part that I was here for, tied with this idea of community and the negotiation that goes with that. So I guess my short answer is that the technologies that I'm talking about, they don't actually reaffirm that in the sense of being in the world together, the process of being in the world together towards a common good. The good thing is, like, my kids are young and they don't even know and hate the technologies that I use. So there's hope that by the time they're older, there'll be something better.
So I agree, but I also think that talking about the internet at this point is not as helpful, right? So in the example that you gave, which is YouTube comments, we can think about how that space is designed to not invite these sort of deep and sustainable conversations between people, right? Because those require buy-in, and you just don't get a lot of buy-in on YouTube comments because the people are going to come, drop some mean comment and leave. There's nothing keeping them there. There's nothing keeping them invested in seeing the same commenters over and over and over again, so that tomorrow they have to be like, dude, you really hurt my feelings. Oh, I'm sorry. Now I have to deal with this fallout. And so, I think, again, another productive way to think about this is to think about them as distinct spaces. And so what can we do to create buy-in in these kinds of communities? What is it about those YouTube comments that invites these sort of hit and run type comments that we don't see in some of the sort of more robust subreddit spaces, because there is buy-in, because there are repeat interactions, and because there are sort of more community-minded, deeper connections?
Good afternoon. My name is Freddie. I have a question regarding Dr. Jennifer and Dr. Paul. Going back to your discussion, Dr. Jennifer, you mentioned alternative facts. We've been hearing that lately on the news a lot regarding the president and the government. And going back to Paul, you mentioned the advances we made in internet and social media throughout the world, and those are covered. I'm just wondering, why are we not addressing the people, and we are getting more response through social media and Twitter instead of talking to people? Like addressing the nation, for example, the president, when he responds, he goes social media. He doesn't use any, like a public discussion with the people or addressing the nation. He just decides to use social media. Is he trying to avoid the questions, or he's trying to, I don't know. It doesn't send a clear message to me. I just want to get your take on that.
Personal psychology aside, so why people use Twitter in the first place. But I know that he has said elsewhere, so, we'll take the president at his word, that he began using Twitter because it was outside the sort of gate-kept, gated traditional media, right? So way back when he was talking about birth certificates, right, that was not an acceptable political discourse, and so it was not getting as much play, and so he sort of had to go around these curated media streams of cable network, of network TV, et cetera, to get to a certain audience and find a specific audience that was receptive to those kinds of ideas. And so I think that's part of the reason, he's sort of talking to his base, and his base doesn't trust TV, certain TV channels. So there are, there's audience questions, there's just personal preference questions, I imagine, at this point. But also I think that the democratic, in the sense of anybody can tweet, and that's meaningful, was a very big reason why years ago he started tweeting in the first place, or why anybody starts tweeting.
And the only thing I'll add, just to follow that up, is this is kind of a journalism issue as well. So the standards of, he's not I think he's the third president that has had, I'm pretty sure the second for sure, that has had regular tweeting happen. And he's tweeting, I think one very easy reason is because the scope of reach that it has is amazing. And not just with his base, but also because he's the president and is considered newsworthy, those are picked up at scope and range, I think, far greater than if he gave a speech or was out in public. He would get covered by the mainstream media, and some people read it on Twitter. Everyone sees it first online. It gets spread everywhere. It's very polarizing, and then the media does their own analysis on it. So it's kind of like it's a super loud microphone that suits the style of really kind of just shallow and jabbing kind of rhetoric.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question in the back.
Hi, I'm Julian. I'm a political science major. How is attempting to regulate discourse on the internet different from mild censorship?
So it's not. No, I don't think we should. I don't know if regulating content on the internet is absolute. I think there's a question of. I guess there's a question of regulation of media companies, right? Like why we have an FCC in the first place, and what the Federal Communications Commission tries to uphold and do in terms of regulating markets and diversity of information. I don't know if I would say. I don't know if I would ever say we should just start to regulate content. I mean, we do regulate content on the internet for sure. We regulate content quite often on the internet. I don't know if we should be regulating civic dialogue, but I guess I would call for us taking a different path towards how we think about what technologies we use and how meaningfully we choose to engage.
I would also add, because again, I agree. I would also add that, I think that democracy requires curation of some kind. We have so much information that's thrown at us all the time, like constantly, that in order to turn that into something meaningful that we can do something with, right? That we know what to care for and how to care for it, right? Those are two different questions. There needs to be some kind of curation because endless streams of information are not helpful. So I think the censorship question is a sort of clear, there is a government that is deciding that for you. It's a sort of paternalistic way of looking at curation. And I think there are alternative ways to think about curation of, again, curate our own information, write those rules and guidelines and keep our eye on that. That is perhaps more democratic and perhaps easier to do online, but I think that's an open question.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you for two wonderful, thought-provoking, and topical discussions. And thank you to everyone for your questions. We'd like to close out today's conference by inviting Provost Warren Sandman to come and share a few words. Thank you all so much.
Well, first I want to thank you all on behalf of William Paterson University, the students who are here, our panelists for this, our panelists for the entire conference. This is a conference that the College of Humanities and Social Sciences put on for a number of years. It gets better every year. It's an important conference, and today's topic is really important. Now, other than being a provost in my real academic life, I'm a rhetorician. I study language. I study how language can be used both to reflect what's out there in reality, to reflect our culture, but how it's also used to shape our culture and to shape what reality is. And as we've heard from our presentations all through the day today and our presentation here at this panel, language and symbols matter. The language that we use, the symbols that we engage with, the channels we use, or in the words of one of the rhetoricians I've studied, a choice of words is a choice of worlds. Those languages, those symbols shape what we do. As rhetoricians, we're taught to really look carefully at language, to think of language as something that's always trying to advance a point, that is never neutral. As rhetoricians, we become very skeptical, perhaps even cynical. And we start thinking about language really as a tool that's being used to disguise, to oppress. But what we forget, and I think what some of our panelists have talked about today here as well, is that language and symbol use can also be, and is also the only way to help building things. Tearing things down is easy. Dropping those vitriolic comments is easy. Making those little rhetorical jabs on Facebook posts and YouTube posts is easy. Using language, using symbols, using our tools of our culture to really try to build something is far more difficult. But as we talk about civic media and civic engagement, and as we talk about trying to shape a truth that we can all work with, we need to remember that the symbols and the languages are the tools we have. And it's up to us to be using those tools here. So once again, thank you very much for being part of this. This was a fantastic conference. We look forward to our next one this next year, Dean Rabbit. Thank you once again.